Welcome back, Year 12s. This is your A-level biology lesson that you're missing because you're all at home. Continuing with our cardiovascular system, we're now looking at tissue fluid. What is tissue fluid and how is it made and why is it so important? Now, we have a little star activity, my little high five quiz that I like to call my recall quiz, high five, to get your virtual high five. What did you learn from your last lesson or last lessons? So, number one, which vessels have valves? Okay, press pause and write it down and then we'll carry on. And number two, which vessels are one cell layer thick? Number three, which is largest? Which is the largest artery in your body? What's the name of the largest artery in your body? Number four, which is the largest vein in your body? And number five, what is your systolic and your diastolic blood pressure? On an average healthy adult, do you know what those two numbers should be? If you press pause, just have a quick check that you've got those answers down and we'll go through them now. So, which vessels have valves? That is veins. Your veins have valves. Which vessels are one cell layer thick? That is your capillaries. Your capillaries are one cell layer thick. Which is the largest artery in your body? The one that leads your heart is the aorta. The aorta is the largest artery in your body. Which are your largest veins in your body? Well, there's two of them because one comes from the top, one comes from the bottom. They're your vena cava. Your vena cava. So you've got the one that comes from beneath, the inferior vena cava, and there's one that comes from the top, the superior vena cava. And then what is your systolic and your diastolic blood pressure? Your systolic blood pressure is when the heart contracts and it causes the surge in blood pressure. But then as the heart relaxes, we call it your, when it goes to diastole. Remember, systole is when the heart contracts. And diastole is when the heart relaxes. So your systolic blood pressure is usually 120 millimeters of mercury. And when the heart relaxes, the diastolic blood pressure is 80 millimeters of mercury. Now, something I didn't mention in our last video, but it kind of links in with this one. The pressure gradient along the system, we need to have that massive squeeze, that massive systolic pressure because it causes that surge. Now, if you look in your textbook, which I'm not actually supposed to be using on the screen, but like what you see is a jagged line here in the aorta here. So it goes 120 and you'll see this jagged line here. On my graphical skills, I couldn't do that on this graph. So you get this 120, 80 like this. And then as you go further down the arteries, it becomes a smooth line and it carries on like that towards zero. So my question to you is this. Why is it jagged here? And then suddenly it becomes smooth as it comes down this graph. I'll have a think. Well, if you remember, by the aorta, the heart is just contracting and it's the systolic pressure, so it's squeezing that blood up, so the pressure hits 120, and then as the heart relaxes, the pressure comes back down to about 80 millimeters of mercury. But I used an analogy in my previous video about these kick-ups. It never goes above too high, it never goes too low. It's kind of hitting it between this sweet spot, between the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. It never goes down to zero. So you get this jagged line here because it's going up and down, and then as it's going further and further down the cardiovascular system through the arteries, the blood starts to flow more smoothly, and that's why you start to get a smoother curve. And as you go through the capillaries, the pressure is extremely low, and when you get to the veins, the pressure pretty much is zero. There's no pressure pushing that blood along. So you need this pressure gradient to get to the capillaries so you can force that blood through the capillaries, but by the time it gets to the veins, the pressure is too low, and hence why in the veins we have the valves. Now, when we're in the capillary beds, you get something called tissue fluid. Now, what is tissue fluid? So, tissue fluid is also known as intercellular fluid. Now, what is it? It's a solution, it's a liquid that surrounds the cells, it bathes the cells. But why is it so important? You need it. You need it because you can't get the substances that's in your blood to those cells, because those cells can be far away from where it's like, imagine a motorway. So you got the motorway, it gets you to your city, but you can't get right into where the house you want to get to. So, because you have to get onto these other little roads to get there eventually. So the house can be far away from the main bit. So it's a bit like that. So you've got these arteries coming along and these capillaries, you get there, but then you need that packaging of the oxygen or the glucose or whatever to get to that particular cell. It needs to end up in the tissue fluid. So the tissue fluid is the stuff that bathes and surrounds the cells, so the substances, useful substances, can get to those cells. Now, why then do we have this tissue fluid, and what does it look like? Well, the easiest example I can give is that if you graze your knee, so if you've grazed your knee, if you get carpet burn, or something more disgusting, if you squeezed a spot or whatever, you sometimes get that watery stuff that's sort of behind the graze. That's what tissue fluid is. Tissue fluid is just that watery substance that sort of surrounds your cells. How much of it do you have in your body? Well, an average adult has about 5 to 6 litres of blood in their body. Well, guess what? Your tissue fluid is almost twice that. So you've got almost twice. You've got 11 litres of tissue fluid in an average person compared to the 5 litres of blood that you have. So it's, approximately twice the amount. But it carries all those nutrients and the things that we need, like amino acids, your sugars, your fatty acids, your enzymes, coenzymes, your hormones, neurotransmitters. You've got minerals in there and the waste products that need to leave your cells. Now, this is the tricky part of this particular chapter. How is the tissue fluid actually formed? Well, the two phrases that you need to get your head around is hydrostatic pressure and osmotic potential. Now, what is hydrostatic pressure? Well, hydro comes from the word water. So hydro means water. Static meaning still. Any water inside a system. So if you've got water inside a pipe and that water is pushing against the walls of something, that's known as hydrostatic pressure. So water pushing against the walls of something is known as hydrostatic pressure. So you need to know that there is going to be hydrostatic pressure within the capillaries, and there's also going to be osmotic potential within the capillaries. So if you imagine, this is what we call a capillary bed. So here's the artery, and as the arteries get smaller, we call arterioles, so they get smaller, and then they branch out into, when they become one cell layer thick, this is your capillary, known as a capillary bed. And the capillary bed will eventually branch back together to something called a venule, which is a tiny, tiny vein, and then you get small veins, and then you get to the larger veins, and then obviously back to your vena cava. So this is where the exchange is happening. Now, how is this working? So I'm going to move on to a more simple graphic, just so that it's easier to get your head around. Well, if you imagine that bit there, that's your arteriole. So this is this bit here, the arteriole. We're just focusing on what's happening inside the capillary bed here. So as the pressure comes to the arteriole, the heart is contracting. The heart is contracting and it's forcing the blood through those blood vessels. Now, when it gets to the capillary, it's going to be at a relatively high pressure. And that's pushing the fluid against the walls. And the water in the system is causing the high hydrostatic pressure. So you're going to get high hydrostatic pressure forcing itself against those capillaries. On this side also, you're going to have osmotic potential. Now, when this liquid part of the blood is in the blood, we call it plasma. So the liquid part of the blood is called plasma because the blood is made up of 4 main parts. More than half of it is plasma. It's like a yellowish straw-like colour liquid where the cells float and all the stuff is dissolved inside of. Then you've got your red blood cells, which makes up nearly the other half of the blood. Then you've got the tiny amount of white blood cells and you've got platelets. So the liquid part that's allowing blood to flow is called plasma. But when you force the watery part of your plasma out of the capillaries, because remember the capillaries are 1 cell layer thick and there's these gaps. Those little gaps will force the water substance out of the capillaries, it's now known as tissue fluid. So its identity changes. It was called plasma when it's inside the blood, but when you never say you force the plasma out because you won't get the marks in the exam. You have to say you're forcing the water out of the capillaries, and now it's called tissue fluid. Now, why does that happen? Now, if I make a larger picture, it's probably easier if I follow this one. On this end, you've got high hydrostatic pressure. You've also got hydrostatic pressure here, but the hydrostatic pressure here is very low compared to in here because that's where the heart is contracting. So you've got systolic pressure. So that's going to be forcing, because the gradient is higher hydrostatic pressure there compared to there, so it's going to force the water out from here to here. You've also got osmotic potential, but the osmotic potential here is greater than the osmotic potential here, but the overall effect is that the net effect of water movement goes from here to here, from the capillary to the bathing intracellular fluid, or the tissue fluid that is here. So water gets forced out, the net effect is water gets forced out. So as the blood continues to move along, if you're forcing water out, that means as you move along, you've only got blood cells here, red blood cells and platelets. Some of the white blood cells can sort of come out of the tiny gaps, but the large proteins and the red blood cells are continuing along the capillary, which means if you're losing water there, that means there's more water here compared to in here, which is just proteins. So what's happening? Why doesn't all of this tissue fluid just keep leaking out? Because you can't just have it leaking out, because eventually you'd run out. So if you imagine my heating system has got water being pumped around the radiator system as it goes round, if water kept leaking out of the system, eventually the water would run out and the whole thing will become grind into a halt, because it will all just become congealed, because it's just got solids just left in there. So you need that liquid to go back. But what is this liquid, this tissue fluid doing? As we pumped out the water, we forced the water out. It's got a high hydrostatic pressure compared to lower here. Forcing the water out, well, this water has a dissolved substances in there. We now call it tissue fluid. It bathes the cells. So useful stuff goes into those cells, so oxygen, glucose, minerals, amino acids, fatty acids can go into the cells. The stuff the cells don't want, the waste products, could be like urea, carbon dioxide, can go back into the tissue fluid. Now that tissue fluid needs to go back into the blood system, or else the system will come to a grinding halt. And we want to excrete, we want to get rid of that the substances like carbon dioxide, urea. We want our lungs to breathe it out, we want our kidneys to get rid of the urea and the excess mineral salts like sodium and potassium and so on. So what will happen is on this side then, on the venual end we call it, now because there's a lot less liquid in there, nearly no liquid at all, the water here is much more. So here now has got a higher hydrostatic pressure on this side, on the venial end, and a low inside the capillary. The osmotic potential here is much higher here now. The osmotic potential, the water potential here, is much higher here. The water potential is higher here compared to inside, because there's a lot less water in there. So you've got this huge gradient now of greater hydrostatic pressure, greater osmotic potential or water potential here. So water will move back into the capillary, end up in the venule, and then back into the veins, and then back into the circulatory system. So making sure that the liquid bit goes back into the circulatory system, or else you just get liquid building up. Now, not all of that liquid is actually, it's not 100% efficient, because if it was, then that'd be great, because you'd have the stuff go out, the stuff come back in, and round and round and round it goes. However, it's not 100% effective, so you can't get all of the liquid back, which means there is a slow loss all the time. Now, eventually, a slow loss is like having a slow leak in my radiator system. If there's a slow leak, eventually after a few weeks, the water would run out again because you've got a leak. So to prevent that from happening, you've got another system called the lymphatic system. This lymphatic system is another type of circulatory system. It's more of a closed system at one end, so the blood vessels, the circulatory system is a closed system. With the lymphatic system, it's an open system, because at one end, it's kind of like snipped open, where the liquids from the tissue fluid, the water in the tissue fluid, can drain into the lymphatic system. And if it gets into the lymphatic system, the name of it now changes. It's now known as lymph. Lymph. So remember, in the blood, we call it plasma. The water in the blood is called plasma. When it's bathing the cells, we call it tissue fluid. And when it's drained into the lymphatic system, we now call it lymph. Ultimately, it's almost like nearly identical stuff. It's just that the composition of the materials are different. So it's just the water with substances dissolved in it. But now it's called lymph when it's in the lymphatic system. But what happens to this lymphatic system? Now, you probably haven't come across the lymphatic system yet, but what it is, the most obvious ones you probably know about, is your tonsils. Your tonsils are part of the lymphatic system. It's like a drainage system. Wherever excess fluids go, eventually, just like how the veins work, the muscle contractions will squeeze on the lymphatic system, and then the lymph will eventually drain back into these glands, and then eventually will drain back into one of the major veins in your body close to your heart, topping back that system. So you'll never run out of that liquid. So that's tissue fluid. Now, the tissue fluid, sometimes things can go a little bit wrong. For instance, there are diseases. One that you may have come across is kwashiorkor. Kwashiorkor is, you may have seen the pictures when there are starving children where there's famine and there's lack of nutrition. If there's a lack of protein in the blood, what can happen is that this excess tissue fluid doesn't drain back into the lymphatic system, doesn't drain back into this system here, and you get an excess buildup of tissue fluid. And you might have seen elephantitis, where like people with swollen up legs, their legs are all swollen up. It's because, again, the tissue fluid isn't draining back into the bloodstream. The kwashiorkor, though, is protein. If you've got a lack of protein in your diet, it means you're not going to have these proteins in your blood, which means you're not going to have many proteins in there, which means you'll have water compared to protein there. You'll have this osmotic potential here, but because you don't have that protein in the blood, the gradient isn't going to be as large, and therefore not all of that liquid, or most of that liquid, isn't going to drain back into your capillaries. And if that doesn't happen, that means you've got this excess fluid bathing your cells. And that classic picture that you see usually you see the starving children, you'll see a distended stomach area, or the intestine area distended, is bloated there, making it look like they're overeating, but actually it's quite the reverse. Malnutrition. They have very, very skinny arms and skinny legs, but you have this distended stomach. That's kwashiorkor, because also known as edema. Edema is the liquid, the tissue fluid, doesn't go back and drain back into the blood system, into the circulatory system, because it can't go back in because of the lack of protein in the diet. So that's tissue fluid. It's one of the more complicated ideas in this particular chapter. So you have to remember these key phrases: hydrostatic pressure and osmotic potential and water potential. And where it's higher here, the hydrostatic pressure, but it's lower there. So that's why it drains back in. It's a classic, possibly 4-mark question for you to make sure you can answer. So I hope this has been useful. That's the end of that section on arteries, veins and capillaries and the formation of tissue fluid. It was on chapter 7.6 in your sequence of learning. Hope this has been useful and hope you're keeping well. If it's been useful, please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And thank you to all the subscribers already out there. And please share. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.